was trying on new panties when my nephew walked in, and what happened next left me questioning everything about my life and choices. How do you confront emotions you're not supposed to feel while keeping a family together? Stick around as I unravel a story of tension, boundaries, and decisions that could change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and share where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts. It wasn't supposed to be a moment I'd remember. Just another lazy Saturday morning. The soft sunlight filtered through the blinds of my bedroom, creating lines of golden warmth on the cream-colored carpet. The house was quiet, unusually so, with my husband away on a weekend fishing trip. I had planned to spend the day indulging myself with some much-needed shopping, self-care, and solitude. What I didn't plan for was the whirlwind that would follow when my nephew, Ryan, unexpectedly showed up at my doorstep. Ryan was only 21, freshly out of college, and staying with us while he looked for a job in the city. He was polite, helpful, and unusually charming for someone so young. I often teased him that he was too smooth for his own good, and he'd flash that disarming smile that could make anyone, myself included, forget what they were saying. My husband adored him, treating Ryan like the son we never had, and I had grown used to his easy presence in the house. But that morning, his presence took on a completely different meaning. It started innocently enough. After a particularly indulgent shopping spree, I brought home a collection of lacy underthings that I hadn't splurged on in years. My marriage with Tom had grown comfortable, predictable even, and I thought a bit of spice wouldn't hurt. As I laid the pieces out on the bed, I couldn't help but smile at how daring some of the choices were. Alone in the house, I slipped into the first set, a delicate black lace ensemble that fit snugly against my skin, hugging curves I didn't know I still had. I turned to the mirror, admiring the way the fabric accentuated my figure. A flicker of something I hadn't felt in years passed through me. Confidence. That's when I heard the door creak open. I froze, my heart racing as I turned toward the sound. Standing in the doorway, his face a mix of shock and something else I couldn't quite place, was Ryan. "Aunt Claire, oh my God, I'm so sorry," he stammered, his eyes darting between the floor and anywhere but me. His face turned crimson as he quickly stepped back, bumping into the door frame in his haste. I scrambled for a nearby robe, fumbling with the fabric as my own embarrassment surged. "Ryan," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "What are you doing? Don't you knock?" I didn't know you were—" He ran a hand through his messy hair, still not meeting my gaze. "The front door was unlocked, and I thought you might need help bringing in groceries or something." "Well, I don't," I shot back, pulling the robe tight around me. "You should have called or texted." "I know, I'm sorry, I'll just—" He gestured awkwardly toward the hallway and began to back away. But before he could fully retreat, our eyes met. It was only for a moment, but it lingered longer than it should have. There was something in his expression, something curious, maybe even admiring, that left me both flustered and strangely flattered. The door clicked shut and I was left standing there, the air in the room suddenly heavier than it had been moments ago. I could feel my pulse in my ears, and my thoughts raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. It was just an accident, I told myself. He wasn't expecting to find me like this. There's nothing more to it. But as I dressed quickly, pulling on a casual sundress to chase away the lingering vulnerability, I couldn't shake the way his face had looked, how his gaze had lingered just a second too long before he bolted. My cheeks flushed at the memory, but not entirely from embarrassment. I stepped out into the hallway, half expecting Ryan to have already left the house entirely, but instead, I found him sitting on the couch in the living room. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his head tilted down, studying the floor as if it held the answers to his internal turmoil. He looked up when I entered, his face still carrying a faint red hue. "I didn't mean to," he began, but I cut him off with a wave of my hand. "It's fine," I said, keeping my tone even. "Let's just forget about it." "Right," he said, nodding quickly, but there was an edge to his voice, a hesitation that told me he was still processing whatever had just transpired. And truthfully, so was I. The room felt unbearably quiet as I moved to the kitchen, putting distance between us. I busied myself with making coffee, the familiar routine calming my nerves. But when Ryan followed, leaning casually against the counter, I couldn't ignore his presence. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice softer now. I glanced at him over my shoulder, trying to read his expression. He hesitated before answering. "Yeah," he said finally. "I just feel bad. I didn't mean to invade your privacy." "I know," I said, turning to face him fully. "But next time, knock, or text, or something." He chuckled lightly, the sound breaking the tension just enough. "Noted." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the hum of the coffee maker filling the void. He seemed to relax, his posture less tense, and I found myself studying him in a way I hadn't before. His broad shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes, so much like his mother's, held a quiet intensity. He wasn't the awkward teenager who used to visit during summers anymore. He was a man now, and the realization caught me off guard. "Coffee?" I offered, holding up a mug. "Sure," he said, his lips curling into a small, grateful smile. As I handed him the mug, our fingers brushed, and though it was nothing more than a fleeting contact, it sent an unexpected shiver through me. I pulled my hand back quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed, but the way his eyes flickered to mine told me he had. Neither of us said anything, the moment hanging between us like a fragile thread, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. I retreated to the kitchen table, needing the space to think clearly. Ryan followed, sitting across from me, his gaze steady but unreadable. We sipped our coffee in companionable silence, the earlier awkwardness fading but not entirely gone. "I should probably head out," he said after a while, setting his mug down. "You don't have to," I said quickly, surprising even myself. He raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by my response. "I mean, if you have plans, that's fine, but if not, you can stay. I could use some company." A flicker of something passed through his expression, surprise, maybe even relief. "Okay," he said, his voice softer now. And just like that, the tension shifted. It wasn't gone, but it had morphed into something quieter, something unspoken. As we settled into a more comfortable rhythm, chatting about everything and nothing, I couldn't help but wonder if that fleeting moment in my bedroom had awakened something we both weren't ready to face. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small talk and carefully avoided tension. Ryan stayed longer than he usually would, which I rationalized as him wanting to make up for the earlier awkwardness. We ate a light lunch together, and I found myself strangely at ease in his company despite the morning's events. But there was something in the way his eyes lingered when he thought I wasn't looking, a flicker of curiosity, a quiet questioning that kept my thoughts circling back to that brief moment in the doorway. As I cleared the dishes Ryan stood and helped without being asked. He was like that, helpful, considerate, the kind of young man every family hoped for. "You don't have to," I said as he grabbed a dish towel to dry the plates I'd just washed. "I don't mind," he replied, his tone easy but warm. He glanced at me with that same steady gaze, and I felt my pulse quicken for reasons I couldn't quite explain, or maybe didn't want to. "Besides, I owe you." For earlier, I gave him a small, tight smile, determined to keep things light. "Let's not revisit that." "Right," he said with a soft laugh. "But still, I feel bad." "I feel bad." "It's fine," I assured him, turning my attention back to the sink. Really, for a few minutes we worked in silence, the clinking of dishes and running water filling the air. It should have been an ordinary moment, something simple and forgettable, but the awareness between us lingered, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, I decided to distract myself by working on a gardening project in the backyard. The warm sun and soft breeze were a welcome distraction, and I lost myself in pruning the overgrown rose bushes that lined the fence. It wasn't long before I heard the screen door creak open and turned to see Ryan stepping out, a glass of lemonade in hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, holding out the glass. His smile was casual, but his presence carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. "Thanks," I said, taking the glass from him. My fingers brushed his, and I felt a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. I busied myself with sipping the lemonade, hoping the cool liquid would calm the sudden rush of heat in my chest. He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the wooden fence, watching me as I worked. "You've got quite the green thumb," he said, nodding toward the neatly trimmed roses. "I try," I replied, glancing at him briefly before returning my focus to the task at hand. "It's a good way to clear my head." "Something on your mind?" he asked, his voice light but probing. "Not really," I lied. "Just stuff. You know how it is." "Yeah," he said, his tone softening. "I do." There was a pause, and when I glanced at him again, I caught the faintest trace of something unreadable in his expression, something that made my stomach flutter in a way that both thrilled and unnerved me. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself relaxing more in his presence. We chatted about his job search, his plans for the future, and his memories of visiting us when he was younger. It was easy, familiar, and yet tinged with a strange undercurrent that neither of us acknowledged. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I invited him to stay for dinner. He hesitated for a moment as if weighing the decision, before nodding. "Sure," he said. "Why not?" I cooked a simple meal: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and a salad. Ryan offered to help again, but this time I insisted he relax. "You're a guest," I said, shooing him out of the kitchen with a playful smile. He laughed but relented, settling onto the couch with his phone. As I worked, I couldn't help but steal glances at him through the kitchen doorway. He looked so at ease, his long legs stretched out on the coffee table, his face lit by the glow of the screen. There was a quiet confidence about him that I hadn't noticed before, a maturity that belied his age. When dinner was ready, we ate at the dining table, the conversation flowing as easily as it had earlier. He told me about his college days, his friends, and the classes he'd loved most. I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks, and for a little while, the morning's awkwardness faded into the background. But as the meal wound down and the plates were cleared, the familiar tension crept back in. It wasn't anything either of us said or did. It was just there, lingering, like the scent of roasted garlic in the air. I felt it in the way his gaze lingered on mine a beat too long, in the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. After dinner, we moved to the living room, and I suggested watching a movie. Your pick, I said, handing him the remote. He flipped through the options, eventually settling on an action comedy we'd both seen before. The movie played, but my attention wandered. Sitting beside him on the couch, close enough to feel the warmth of his arm against mine, I was acutely aware of every movement, every breath. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But the quickening of my pulse said otherwise. Halfway through the movie, he shifted slightly, his knee brushing against mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I glanced at him, expecting to see an apology in his expression, but instead I found his eyes fixed on me, searching, questioning. Something wrong? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No, he said, shaking his head slightly, but he didn't look away. Nothing at all. The moment stretched between us, charged and fragile. I wanted to say something, to break the spell, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. When the movie ended, I stood quickly, breaking the silence with an exaggerated yawn. Well, I think I'm going to call it a night, I said, forcing a lightness into my voice that I didn't feel. Yeah, he said, standing as well. It's getting late. I walked him to the door, my hand resting on the knob as I turned to face him. Thanks for spending the day with me, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I had enjoyed his company more than I cared to admit. Anytime, he said, his smile soft but genuine. For a moment I thought he might say more, but he hesitated, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting mine again. Good night, Aunt Claire. Good night, Ryan, I replied, my voice steady despite the fluttering in my chest. As the door closed behind him, I leaned against it, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The house felt impossibly quiet, the stillness amplifying the thoughts swirling in my mind. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't quite name but couldn't deny. And as I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, I knew that the day's events would stay with me, far longer than they should. The next morning, I woke to the familiar sound of birds chirping outside my bedroom window, but my thoughts were anything but serene. The events of the previous day replayed in my mind on a loop, each memory sharp and vivid, refusing to fade into the background. I told myself I was overthinking, that the tension I felt was nothing more than the lingering awkwardness of an accidental encounter. But deep down, I knew better. Husband's machine rumbled constantly along the door as I inhaled deeply. I tried to shake off the unease by throwing myself into housework. With Tom still away, the house was quieter than usual, and I welcomed the distraction of vacuuming, dusting, and organizing the cluttered pantry. By midday, I had worked up a sweat and decided to take a break on the patio with a glass of iced tea. I was just settling into my chair when I heard the faint rumble of an engine pulling into the driveway. A quick glance revealed Ryan's familiar car. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately chastised myself for the reaction. It was perfectly normal for him to stop by, I told myself. He probably forgot something or needed to pick up mail. Still, I couldn't ignore the rush of nervous energy as I watched him step out of the car and head toward the door. Before he could knock, I called out to him from the patio. Ryan, Out here. He turned, his expression shifting to one of surprise, then a smile as he walked toward me. "Morning, Aunt Claire," he said, his voice as casual as ever. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "What brings you by?" He hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering toward the house before settling on me. "I just wanted to check in, make sure you're okay after yesterday." I laughed lightly, though it sounded more strained than I intended. "Ryan, you don't have to keep apologizing. It's fine. Really, I know," he said, sitting down and leaning back in the chair. "But I felt bad, and I guess I just wanted to see you." His words hung in the air, simple yet weighted with an unspoken meaning I couldn't quite place. I sipped my iced tea, hoping the coolness would calm the warmth creeping up my neck. "Well, I'm fine. Busy, but fine." We sat in silence for a moment, the breeze rustling the leaves of the nearby oak tree. It was a comfortable silence, yet it buzzed with an undercurrent of something more. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, almost tentative. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, setting my glass down and giving him my full attention. "Do you ever feel—" He trailed off, his brow furrowing as he searched for the right words. "Like you're stuck? Like you're just going through the motions?" His question caught me off guard. It was so direct, so unexpectedly personal. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. But his earnest expression drew the truth from me. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I think everyone feels that way at some point." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the table between us. "That's how I've been feeling lately, like I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing or where I'm supposed to be. And yesterday—" He looked up at me then, his eyes locking onto mine. "I guess it made me realize some things." My heart thudded in my chest, and I quickly averted my gaze, focusing instead on the condensation forming on my glass. "Realize what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Glancing away from him, I saw Yuri, standing by the pier, narrowing his eyes. He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his words were careful, deliberate. "That maybe I've been looking for clarity in all the wrong places." The weight of his gaze was almost too much to bear, and I felt my pulse quicken as I searched for something, anything, to say that would steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Ryan, you're young. You have time to figure things out." "I know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "but sometimes it feels like time's slipping away faster than I can catch it." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the table, shattering the moment. I snatched it up, grateful for the distraction, and saw a text from Tom. "Hey, fishing trip's wrapping up early. Should be home by tonight. Love you." I stared at the screen for a moment, the words grounding me in reality. Tom. My husband. The man I had built a life with for over a decade. Whatever strange tension had been building between Ryan and me, it was nothing compared to the bond I shared with Tom. I reminded myself of that as I typed a quick reply and set the phone back down. "Everything okay?" Ryan asked, his voice breaking through my thoughts. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Tom's coming home tonight." "Ah," he said, leaning back in his chair. "That's good. You must miss him." "Of course," I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. "It's always nice to have him home." Ryan nodded, but his expression was unreadable. The silence between us grew heavier, and I found myself wishing he would leave, though I didn't have the heart to say so. Instead, I stood and picked up my empty glass. "I should get back to work," I said, my voice firmer now. "Thanks for stopping by." "Sure," he said, standing as well. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to say more, but then he simply smiled. "See you later, Aunt Claire." I watched him walk back to his car, the tension in my chest finally easing as the sound of his engine faded into the distance. But even as I returned to my chores, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us yet again, something that couldn't be undone. That evening, as I prepared for Tom's return, I found myself glancing at the clock more often than usual. I tidied the house, double-checked the dinner menu, and even changed into one of the new dresses I had bought during my shopping spree. But no matter how much I tried to focus on my husband's arrival, my thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan. By the time Tom walked through the door, I had managed to push those thoughts to the back of my mind, greeting him with a warm smile and a hug. He seemed tired but happy, recounting tales of his fishing trip as we sat down to dinner. It was a pleasant evening, the kind of routine comfort I had grown to cherish. But as the night wore on and Tom drifted off to sleep beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed the day's conversations with Ryan, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the unspoken questions in his gaze. I hated the way those moments lingered in my thoughts, refusing to fade, and I hated myself for letting them. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of confusion, a ripple in the steady waters of my life. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was happening between Ryan and me, it was only the beginning. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The third time I tried to say no to him. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. I buried myself in routine, clinging to the predictability of my life with Tom. I kept myself busy with errands, phone calls, and preparing for an upcoming neighborhood event that required all my attention. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, Ryan's presence lingered in my thoughts, like a faint echo I couldn't quite silence. Tom, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me, was his usual affable self. He talked about work, watched his favorite shows in the evenings, and even mentioned how much he appreciated Ryan stopping by while he'd been away. "He's such a good kid," Tom said one night as we sat on the couch together. "It's nice to see him settling in here." I nodded, smiling faintly. "Yeah, he's great," I said, my voice careful and even. If Tom noticed my hesitation, he didn't show it. But Ryan wasn't settling in, at least, not in a way that felt innocent anymore. His visits became more frequent, under the pretense of needing advice about job applications or wanting to help around the house. And while I should have set boundaries, I found myself unable or unwilling to do so. I told myself I was just being a supportive aunt, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was late one afternoon when Ryan stopped by unannounced again. Tom was working late and I was folding laundry in the living room when the knock came. I opened the door to find him standing there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Am I interrupting?" "No," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Just folding clothes. What's up?" He shrugged, glancing around the room before meeting my gaze. "I guess I just wanted to see you. Is that okay?" His words hit me harder than they should have. There was nothing inherently wrong with them, yet the weight behind them felt palpable. "Of course," I said, my tone light. "You know you're always welcome here." He smiled faintly but didn't sit. Instead, he lingered near the doorway, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. "Where's Uncle Tom?" "Working late," I replied, turning back to the laundry basket in an attempt to keep things casual. "He's been swamped lately." Ryan nodded, stepping closer. "You're always so busy too," he said, his voice lower now. "Do you ever take a break? do something for yourself? I paused, his question catching me off guard. I guess I don't think about it much, I admitted, folding a shirt with deliberate care. There's always something that needs to be done. You should, he said simply. You deserve to. There it was again, that quiet intensity in his voice, the way his words seemed to carry a deeper meaning. I forced a smile, brushing off the comment with a laugh. I'll keep that in mind. We moved to the kitchen where I offered him a drink. He leaned against the counter as I poured us both glasses of iced tea, his gaze following my movements. The air between us felt charged, and I struggled to keep my focus on the small talk we made about his job search and his plans for the weekend. But then he said something that made my heart skip a beat. Yesterday, I was thinking about what you said, he began, his tone careful. About everyone feeling stuck sometimes. I glanced at him, trying to read his expression. What about it? I guess it made me realize how much I rely on you, he said, his eyes meeting mine. You're always there for me. It means more than you probably know. My chest tightened, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Gratitude, guilt, and something I couldn't quite name. Ryan, your family. Of course I'm here for you. I know, he said, stepping closer. But it's more than that. You're different, special. His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I set my glass down, my hands trembling slightly. Ryan, I began, but my voice faltered. His eyes fluttered and opened. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was the lightest touch, but it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't stop thinking about you. The room seemed to tilt, my breath catching in my throat as his words sank in. I wanted to pull away, to shut this down before it went any further, but I found myself frozen, torn between the pull of his sincerity and the voice in my head screaming that this was wrong. My eyes focused. Ryan, I said again, this time more firmly. You can't. We can't. I know, he said quickly, his expression pained. I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel. I stepped back, needing the distance to think clearly. This isn't right, I said, my voice shaking. You're my nephew, Tom's nephew. We can't do this. I know, he repeated, his shoulders slumping. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's okay, I said, cutting him off. We just need to forget about this, pretend it never happened. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. You're right. I'm sorry. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence thick with unspoken tension. Then he straightened, forcing a small, strained smile. I should go, he said. Maybe that's a good idea, I said, my voice softer now. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but then he turned and walked to the door. I followed, my heart pounding as I watched him step outside. Ryan, I called after him just as he was about to leave. He stopped, turning back to look at me. Take care of yourself, okay? He nodded, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. You too, he said. And then he was gone. I closed the door, leaning against it as I let out a shaky breath. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I told myself this was the end of it, that nothing else would happen. But as I sat down on the couch, my thoughts racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The days following Ryan's emotional confession were a blur of avoidance and forced normalcy. I kept myself busy, throwing every ounce of my energy into mundane tasks. Scrubbing floors that didn't need cleaning, reorganizing the pantry, and running errands just to avoid being home. But no matter how much I tried to escape, Ryan's words lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at my resolve. Tom, as always, remained blissfully unaware of the growing tension in our lives. He came home from work each evening with the same routine: a kiss on my cheek, a question about dinner, and a brief recounting of his day before settling onto the couch to watch TV. If he noticed the stiffness in my demeanor or the way I flinched when he touched me, he didn't say anything. It was a week later when the inevitable happened. Ryan showed up again. This time, he didn't knock. The familiar sound of the front door opening sent a jolt through me as I stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. I turned to see him standing there, his expression a mix of determination and hesitation. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but low. "Ryan, this isn't a good time," I said quickly, glancing toward the hallway where Tom was napping in the bedroom. My heart raced as I moved toward him, trying to usher him back toward the door. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he said, not moving. "But I can't keep pretending like everything's fine." "It's not." I sighed, my hands trembling as I placed them on his shoulders and gently pushed him toward the door. "We've already talked about this. It can't happen." "It won't. It won't." He looked at me then, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite name, something that made me feel simultaneously exposed and understood. "You're not happy, Aunt Claire. Don't tell me you are." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to protest, to argue, but the truth lodged itself in my throat. I wasn't happy. I hadn't been for years. Tom was a good man, steady and reliable, but somewhere along the way, our spark had fizzled out. I had buried my discontent beneath layers of routine and loyalty, convincing myself that this was just what marriage was, a slow burn that eventually cooled. But hearing Ryan say it aloud was different. It cracked something open inside me, something I wasn't ready to face. "Go," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Please." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and stepped back toward the door. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I needed you to know how I feel." And then he was gone, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and my thoughts spiraling. Sally. That evening, as I sat across the dinner table from Tom, I couldn't help but notice how distant he felt. He ate his meal in silence, his eyes fixed on the newspaper he had propped up beside his plate. It was a scene we had replayed countless times over the years, and yet tonight, it felt suffocating. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stared at him, wondering how we had ended up here. Two people living under the same roof, but worlds apart. "Everything okay?" he asked suddenly, glancing up from his paper. His tone was casual, as if he hadn't noticed my inner turmoil. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He nodded, accepting the excuse without question, and returned to his reading. I stared down at my plate, my appetite gone, and wondered if this was it. If this was what my life would look like forever. 2 days later, the twist I never saw coming unraveled in the most unexpected way. I was sitting on the patio, sipping my morning coffee and scrolling through my phone when a notification popped up, a message from Ryan. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen, before finally opening it. It wasn't what I expected. Aunt Claire, I know you said we can't talk about this, but there's something you need to know. It's about Tom. Please meet me. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. My stomach dropped. The cryptic nature of the message sent my mind racing, and despite my better judgment, I found myself replying, "What's going on?" His response was immediate. "I'd rather tell you in person. Please. Coffee shop on Main. 11 a.m. I stared at the message, debating whether to go. But curiosity and the subtle dread pooling in my chest won out. I grabbed my keys and left, telling Tom I needed to pick up a few things from the store. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Ryan was already there, sitting at a table near the window. He stood as I approached, his expression serious. "Ryan, what's this about?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair before meeting my gaze. "I didn't know how to tell you this," he began, "but you deserve to know the truth." "About what?" I pressed, my patience wearing thin. "About Uncle Tom," he said, his voice steady. I saw him. Last week." "Saw him where?" I asked, confusion lacing my tone. "At a restaurant," he said, "with another woman." The words hit me like a tidal wave, stealing the air from my lungs. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to believe it at first," he continued, his expression pained. "But they were, together. It wasn't just a friendly dinner. I saw them holding hands, laughing. It was intimate." My mind reeled, the implications of his words crashing down around me. Tom? My Tom? The man who had been my anchor for over a decade? I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "There must be some mistake," I said. "You must have misread the situation." And Ryan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I thought the same thing," he said, "so I took a picture. I didn't want to tell you unless I was sure." He slid the phone across the table and my hands trembled as I picked it up. The photo was grainy but unmistakable. Tom, sitting across from a younger woman, his hand resting over hers as they leaned in close, smiles lighting their faces. My vision blurred with tears, and I set the phone down, my chest heaving with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "I don't understand," I whispered. Why would he do this?" "I don't know," Ryan said softly, "but you deserve better. You deserve to be happy." I looked at him then, his expression full of concern, and something deeper. Something that made my heart ache in a way I couldn't explain. Everything I thought I knew was crumbling around me, and for the first time, I didn't know where to turn or what to do next.